Ewarabash. Alright, this is my fourth try. I have not been happy with the first couple attempts at this, but let's try it again. This is on Kurds in the USSR, 1917 to 1956, and the Kurdish population in the Soviet Union. Obviously, 1917, beginning of Soviet power after the Bolshevik Revolution in October, but Soviet Union itself only comes about in December 1922, the result of a treaty between various existing Soviet Socialist republics, most notably the RSFSR, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian republics, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, which is where almost all of the Kurdish population, except for a small group in Turkmenistan, who come there, resettled there earlier by the Persians, live. And they, as a result of Russian expansion southward against the Ottomans and the Persians, particularly the Russian victory over the Persians in the 1804-1813 war, result in the Kurdish populations coming under Russian rule from the defeat of Persia in 1813 all the way up till 1916. There's Kurdish immigration into the territories taken by the Russian Empire from both the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire, particularly migration into what is today Azerbaijan. There is also obviously Kurds that are living in the territories taken from these two empires. We will talk about in later, and this presentation will be one of the focuses because it's something I've done a little bit of research on, a little bit of writing on. The fate of the Kurds that were living in Meskhetiya, which was part of Georgia, but it was taken from the Ottomans in 1828-1829. And so that Georgian part of Georgia, the Kurdish population, had already been there established when it comes under Russian rule. They did not migrate into Meskhetiya after it was taken from the Ottomans. They had already been there living alongside the Turkish and the Hemshins, who are Armenians who had converted to Islam, that were there as well. So the Kurds obviously spread out a fairly large territory, and this includes into the Caucasus, but also movement out of the Kurdish core regions into the Caucasus also occurs at this time. And so after the revolution, we have the creation of the three Soviet republics in the Transcaucasus. And in Azerbaijan is where most of the Kurdish population is at this time. And then there are smaller Kurdish populations in Armenia and Georgia. So in 1897 Russian census, the only full census of the Tsarist Empire, has about 100,000 people speaking Kurdish. But I think that number might be too high because the 1926 census gives the number of Kurds in the Soviet Union, many whom don't speak Kurdish, is much lower. It's this is a census number here. In 1926 census, a little less than 70,000 Kurds and Yazidis. They are separate categories only in the 1926 census. They are merged in the 1939 census and later. But this presentation is only going to go up to 1956. So we won't be discussing the 1959 census, which is the next one. So most of the Yazidis are in Armenia, and most of the Sunni Kurds in Azerbaijan. And the huge drop between 26 and 39 in the Kurdish population of Azerbaijan, mainly due to a reclassification of Kurds as Azeris. In some cases, maybe legitimate assimilation. Out of 37,000 people in the 26th census claiming to be Kurdish in the territory that was Kurdistan administrative territory, although it had no national function, just the name. Uh, it's called Red Kurdistan. It's between Nagorno-Karabakh and the borders of the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic. There's some 37,000 Kurds there. Only 3,000 can speak Kurdish, according to the 1926 census. So this is a very small number, percentage-wise. The vast majority of them are speaking Azeri. But I suspect that most of the drop in the numbers are people just being reclassified. Azerbaijani communists are national communists, and they want to increase the number of Azeris and decrease the number of non-Azeris in Azerbaijan. So they reclassify large numbers of non-Azeris, particularly the Kurdish population, as being Azeri. There is also some migration out voluntarily to Armenia and Georgia, much of it pressured by these types of cultural intolerance. There's very, very little in the way of any Kurdish language institutions and schools in Azerbaijan. And there's quite a bit in comparison, although most of the population benefiting are Yazidis, not Sunni, in Armenia, particularly in the 30s. And in 1937, there's even more greater repression. About 3,000 Kurds, mostly from Azerbaijan, forcibly deported into Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, where they are mostly agricultural workers, but some working in rubber factories, some in mining. But this is the first forced relocation of Kurds from the Caucasus into Central Asia. It's the smaller wave, about 3,000. The larger wave will occur after the Second World War in November 1944. So there is cultural repression, kind of restrictions on Korenizatsiya, this nativization, indigenization movement for various non-Russian peoples. It is basically terminated or severely restricted for many of the smaller nationalities starting in 1937 and 1938 during the Great Terror. And the Kurds are one of these groups which suffer from it. Particularly, we saw the deportation from Azerbaijan. But even in Armenia, there's a rolling back of the cultural institutions, Kurdish language education, etc., that was happening earlier in the 1930s. During the Second World War, a lot of Kurds fight in the Soviet Red Army. I don't have any good exact numbers, but we do know that a number did fight in various units, including partisan units fighting in the underground against the Nazis occupying Ukraine. We know a number were awarded various Soviet military medals and honors for their role in fighting against the Nazis during the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, the Soviet government prepares for conflict with Turkey. And the conflict is over both attempts to get a military base in the Dardanelles Straits and to get the territory of Kars and Ardahan, which had been under Tsarist Russian rule from 1879 until the collapse of the Tsarist Empire. And one of the people who strongly supported this was Beria, the head of the People's Commissary of Internal Affairs, who himself was Georgian. And there is, in preparation for this, the need to remove all of the populations that are Muslim and historically associated with the Ottoman Empire and then hence Turkish Republic in an indirect way from the border of Georgia and Turkey. So the Soviet NKVD rounds up the Meskhetian Turks, over 90,000 of them, about 9,000 Kurds, and then a smaller population, about 1,500 Hemshins, who are Armenians who converted to Islam. They are taken on Studebakers to train stations, stuffed into cattle cars, and forcibly deported eastward into Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. And here they are placed under special settlement restrictions, NKVD special commandants uh, looking over them, surveilling them, preventing them from leaving their assigned places of residence and work. In the vast majority of cases, collective farms. In order to even go to the market, they need special written permission from the special commandant. They need it. They get like a little pass, like almost like an internal visa to travel a short distance to go to the bazaar. You need it signed from the commandant from the place you're leaving, and then the place you're going to, and then upon return. And they're limited to no more than 3 days. So they have to report to the special commandants every month. Often a humiliating experience. So they are not full citizens, under second-class citizens here, under restricted civil rights, particularly the right to move. And with that, of course, restrictions on their occupation, mainly limited to working on these collective farms, limited to where they can go to seek higher education or any education at all for that matter. And finally, of course, since they are forcibly deported with almost nothing, there's a very large increase in their mortality and morbidity rates. Overall, about 15% perish in the first 5 years of exile between 1944 and 1949. I don't have any. I haven't seen any numbers exactly on the Kurds themselves, but the whole cohort, which is mostly Meskhetian Turk, uh, it's about the official numbers are about 15%, fairly high. And they are under these restrictions until late April of 1956. So let's see when they're actually freed. I believe it's 28th of April. Yeah, 28th of April 1956. So that's 3 years after Stalin had already died, 5th of March 1953. And so for 1944, the starting date, we can see it said 12 years in exile. But the exile doesn't end because for the most part, not allowed to return to Georgia. But they are released from the various restrictions imposed upon them by the NKVD special commandants. This system is abolished in the Soviet Union under Khrushchev, and we have kind of a move towards socialist legality away from the arbitrary terror of the Stalin regime. And almost all of the Kurds in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan today can trace their origin to either the first deportation from Azerbaijan, primarily in 1937, or the more likely the 1944 deportation in Georgia, which was considerably larger, some 9,000 Kurds, so 3 times as many, deported into Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. And this isn't a story that has a lot of publicity either in Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, a place I spent quite some time, or in Kurdistan, which I've been in for a couple of years now. Generally, the story of the Kurds in the USSR Uh, the part about the 9,000 or so Kurds from Georgia being deported into Central Asia is generally not very well known. It's one of the reasons perhaps there are so many communists still in Kurdistan. They're unaware of Soviet persecution of the Kurdish population from Meskheti and transplanting them forcibly for agricultural labor into Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan under restricted rights of mobility and the fact that their initial material conditions upon resettlement as far as food and housing and medical care were so inadequate that some 15% perished in 5 years, a much higher excess mortality rate than one would expect among a normal population, and most of the deaths occurring as a result of malnutrition and disease, particularly typhus, and also exposure was another cause. So not a particularly happy event in the history of the Kurdish uh, population, one of the diasporas, but I think something necessary to look at here historically. Uh, I think perhaps a good way, particularly for my students, who again mostly Kurdish, something to bear in mind when they listen to many or read many of Kurdish intellectuals glorifying the Soviet Union and other socialist states, that the Kurds that were already living in that socialist state, a lot of them did not do well. Now, the number deported was a minority of the Kurdish population in the Soviet Union as a whole. So it was no more than 25%. So it wasn't like some of the other nationalities, which were close to 100%, which is the Crimean Tatars or the Kalmuks or the Chechens being deported. But nonetheless, it's still a very significant minority, very large percentage of the population that were mistreated in this way during the Stalin era. And so, and obviously, the mistreatment was not because the Kurds were anti-Soviet or because they had rose up against Soviet power, but merely because historically the Kurds had had an association with the neighboring Turks, even if it wasn't the goodest association. Obviously, uh, like with the Koreans being deported for being potential threat to allow Japanese espionage into the Soviet Far East, right? It's one of these things where the Soviet government uh, just doesn't care. It classified people along the basis of nationalnost and then dealt with them in that manner. So we have very clear and undeniable institutional racism, racial discrimination on the against whole classes of people based upon the fact that Soviet policies are aiming for specific outcomes. In this case, a removal of everybody who's Muslim from the border of Turkey and Georgia, everybody who has a historical link or association to uh, the Ottoman Empire and therefore, by extension, the Turkish Republic. And this includes anybody in those villages who uh, ha- can trace their origins back to that time, and that includes, of course, the Kurdish population, even despite the poor relations between Kurds and Turks that had developed under Ataturk. So socialism doesn't end up with us all singing Kumbaya. Some people are sent into exile and not allowed to join hands with others to sing Kumbaya. And I'll leave it at that now. Hopefully, I'll get some interest in this video, particularly people here in Bashur, the history of the Kurdish diaspora in Central Asia, its origins, and the deportees from Azerbaijan and particularly Georgia, and to kind of remember here uh, what happened with these people, the tragedy. And until then, I'll see everybody later. Shoshad.